Virtually every reading comprehension passage will have a question that asks you to summarize the main point or main idea of the passage. And you can interpret this question as, where does the author spend the most amount of time, or how does the author want to change your actions and beliefs? The trap answer in these kinds of questions, or the answer that looks tempting but is still wrong, is often an answer that mentions something that is true, that was in the passage, but it was only mentioned once or for a short amount of time. For example, in this case, answer choice A states that the author won the Pulitzer Prize. And that's true. That did happen, but it was only mentioned in the first paragraph and nowhere else. While the correct answer, answer choice D, is a lot more broad in its scope. I know you haven't actually read the passage, but I can tell you the passage is about two individuals, Thomas and Beulah. Half the passage is about Thomas and his psychological and emotional events, and half the passage is about Beulah and her psychological and emotional events. And then there's a paragraph that compares and contrasts the two lives. So within answer choice D, there are actually 5 paragraphs lightly mentioned, which makes it the most broad and therefore the most correct answer. When you're evaluating your answer choices, you also want to pay special attention to the tone in the argument. Passages can be very neutral or very opinionated, and a passage can be talking about the author's ideas or another person's ideas. If an answer choice has a word like present, that answer choice would be appropriate for a passage that was neutral, where the author was simply talking about things that have happened or what other people think without labeling those ideas or events as right or wrong. A word like suggest would be appropriate for a passage where the author brings up ideas that are either his or her own or ideas that that author agrees with. Words like argue in favor or question are appropriate for a passage that is highly opinionated, where it's very clear whether an author is for or against a specific idea. Whereas a word like discuss is a lot more neutral. The author might talk about the implications or the consequences, but never firmly say which idea is right or wrong. If you're having trouble identifying the main point of the passage, the last paragraph is often the best place to look, which is a bit different from how you and I were taught how to write an appropriate essay. In most high schools and colleges, they teach that when you write an essay, you want to clearly state your thesis in the first paragraph. But because these exams are trying to trick and confuse us, the first paragraph of the original essay is often omitted. So it isn't until the last paragraph that the author finally has a point to summarize his or her main point. You can often identify the main point in a passage in the exact same way that we identify conclusions in critical reasoning passages. We can look for key words such as thus or however. And just like we do with critical reasoning passages, it's very important to quote the conclusion directly. You don't want to overstate or inappropriately summarize the author's main point. For example, in this case, the conclusion is that it is unreasonable to count NDEs, which stand for near-death experiences. It is unreasonable to count NDEs as compelling evidence for the existence of God or the afterlife. A trap answer for this conclusion might try to restate the main point of the passage as, the author thinks there is no good evidence for God or the afterlife. Or the author thinks that God or the afterlife does not exist. But that would be overstating the argument. The author doesn't say there is no evidence for God or the afterlife. He just says near-death experiences should not count as compelling evidence. So even though we might think that the author has a negative attitude towards God and the afterlife, there is actually zero information in the passage about the author's true beliefs about God or the afterlife. All we know is that the author doesn't think that near-death experiences are compelling evidence.